Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm Allie Ogasian, and I'm one of the organizers of the event. So Setting Out explores how the nature of expeditions has evolved into the modern day, incorporating the work of archaeologists, engineers, scientists, and artists exploring a variety of realms, both geographical and beyond. The exhibition demonstrates that all of these expeditions share the same eager hunger to uncover the unknown.
Thank you, Ali. Do you want to take a seat, or do you want to? Oh, you stood up there. Welcome, and thank you for coming out this evening. This very cold evening. So we're really honoured here to have this evening Jana Kaplan and Heidi Nielsen to discuss topics relating to human survival in outer space. Jana will draw on her experience as a space research specialist to discuss the tasks and challenges preparing astronauts for spaceflight, while Nielsen will present her Menu for Mars Supper Club project, which envisions the future of cuisine in Mars. So a brief introduction to Jana. Jana, I always get it wrong, got to get it right. Jana Kaplan is a lecturer in psychology and senior research associate at Brandeis University Gabriel Lab, and she's specializing in neuropsychology and space research. She studies human adaptation to various conditions of spaceflight, such as zero-G, high-G, artificial gravity, environment, spatial orientation. You can tell me if I'm wrong here. And space motion, sickness, and movement errors in changing gravitational force environments. So welcome, Jana. Thank you.
And I'll introduce Heidi Nielsen, who's to my left. Heidi is an artist addressing topics such as weather, fake snow, and the cultural landscape of outer space. Her work is often collaborative and publishing-based. She is a member of the ABC Artist Books Cooperative, co-founded SP Weather Station, and her work is included in over 60 museum and university collections.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming, and thanks Apex Art and Shona and Ali for inviting me. So I'm here to talk about the Menu for Mars Supper Club, which is organized by me and Douglas Paulson, basically it started out as a supper club that was an educational program of Flux Factory, and the idea was that we would go out to different restaurants around New York City, and we chose our restaurants based on cuisines that were based in countries that had active space programs of one kind or another. And at each one, we invited a special guest of some kind or another to come and talk to us kind of casually over dinner about how we would envision how the menu that we looked at, and also what their expertise to envision what the future of cuisine might be on Mars. And so we would, at each meeting, we would review all of the, we'd have sheets around that we would write notes on and everything, but we'd review the actual the facts of what we know about the conditions on Mars. So this is an example of it. In this one, we had our guest was an astrophysicist, Jana Krevich, and she spoke to us about cooking methods. But the main thing here is that people living on Mars would always be in a pressurized environment, so always inside. It'd be basically like camping inside of a airplane capsule forever, or being in a spacesuit. So it's kind of in the tradition of Mars analogs, where places on Earth are chosen to be very, that as close as possible to the conditions on Mars, and then people go there and sort of pretend like they're living on Mars. And so there's a bunch of different ones of these, like actually funded NASA ones where they try out space equipment and so on, and then ones like this that are more space enthusiasts go. So we also looked at the International Space Station, so all of the things that are going on there. I mean, Mars is really different from the microgravity of the International Space Station, but we're sort of looking at the approaches and everything that we have now. So so we were looking at the environment that they're eating in and noticing things like the sriracha there that's like Velcro taped to the wall. It turns out that sriracha, for example, and other things that are really spicy are actually really popular foods because a lot of the conditions of the body in space make, for example, your head really stuffy. So it's like having a cold, at least for first few weeks or something. So having spicy foods is is quite popular. And so we were also looking at adaptations of different traditions. So like the turkey here on the wall, like for Thanksgiving. And making special meals. Like most of the meals on the International Space Station are already prepared. They're like meals ready to eat, and so all you can do is just heat them up. They're just already set up, and you just like open the bag and then eat out of it directly. But in this case, this is an astronaut who was preparing a special meal, and it's from her blog. And so it was all about like combining different ingredients and making them in Ziploc bags and like trying to squish the ingredients around in the Ziploc bags, because you can't have anything like crumbs or anything in space, like nothing that can float around, obviously, because it would like get in your eyes or like in your ears or whatever. So, and you can't have any open flame. So like on the left is a flame in microgravity, on the right is a regular candle. So, so how that adapts to things like a birthday cake, right? So if you can't have crumbs, because those are totally out, and you can't have flame, so you can't have candles, like how do you celebrate something like a birthday? So like how does that, how would you bring like a tradition to a whole other environment? So this is an inflatable cake that was given to a commander. So that was the way around it that time. So anyway, that's the kind of thing that we would discuss at the Menu for Mars Supper Club. So this is dim sum, out for dim sum, and we were looking at eating insects. So we were examining like the idea of using insects as an alternate source of protein. So flash forward about a year. This is last year, May and June, at the boiler space in Brooklyn of Pierogi Gallery. And we decided that we wanted to, with all of this accumulated knowledge, actually try cooking for ourselves. And so we set up this inflated kitchen. So we basically took construction plastic and duct taped it together and inflated it with a fan. And we set up this whole habitat, and we looked at a whole bunch of different aspects of living on Mars, but the central part, so I just wanted to illustrate that it's more extensive than we have time for here, and it involves more than 20 artists doing various projects in it. But anyway, centering on the kitchen itself, in the middle, so this is the interior, we had this pantry. So the pantry was all ingredients that have extremely long shelf life, like they're going to have, like they're planning for Mars. So there are all these, we were pretending like it was kind of like a shipment to Mars. So all the things are like freeze-dried foods or like powdered things, thermostabilized things, basically nothing that's fresh. So like all fresh foods are out, anything that's, so we had like kind of a strict, like no fresh foods in here. You had to like use the equipment that's in there. But the idea is that people could kind of peruse through the ingredients and then cook for themselves, like try to cook from this ingredients. And this is from an event that we had just 2 weeks ago in Washington, D.C., so I'm kind of like interspersing both of the things. But anyway, so you would open the bags and like rummage through the different ingredient lists and try cooking some stuff. So various experiments going on. This was like dried mango in a bowl, and then more cooking. And then also to write down all the ingredients you're using, and then your instruction sheet, the idea of making a recipe. So we were collecting those and then doing things like noting on the sheets if there were any physical things that were happening that might be different on Mars. So kind of like trying to envision those things. We were taking the smells of the things and seeing if they were appetizing. and tasting them, and then ultimately sharing on user reviews like of the recipes. So and the kind of funny part in the whole thing is that like the food isn't that good, you know? Like all of us are interested in, you know, fresh cuisine and like farm to table kinds of things. And so this was like a struggle to make things really inventive and interesting. And so anyway, we vacuum packed a sample of it, which was a lot of fun, actually. It was just like a really engaging thing to do. And then labeled the sample so that it matched the recipe. And then we were starting a book like that, which we're still working on now. Yeah, so that's a label. And then so we're collecting this book with all of the findings, and the idea is that we're combining all of them and sending them to NASA and other space program initiatives to help them out with all of our research. So anyway, that's the menu from our supper club.
Can I use your mic?
Oh, yes, please.
Because this is a good angle. Well, so now I have to give you a lecture on space flight human factors in 3 minutes. So this is what I do. I study human factors in space flight from the point of view of neuropsychology, neurophysiology, and what is understood to be within human factors spectrum are all those things. You can read them. Space motion sickness is a beauty because that one involves a lot of vomiting. And vomiting is it's really not a sickness. It's not a disease at all. It's a completely normal reaction of human body to very, very abnormal environmental features. And so vomiting on Earth is really no big deal because vomit goes down to the ground because of gravity. Now, in 0G, you see, there is all forces cancel out. Okay, so it's a weightless environment. So vomitus, being a liquid thing, breaks, as all liquids in 0G, breaks down into microcaplets, and they just float around. So you inhale them, that can cause pneumonia or any other kind of internal infections, which is bad enough. But what is even worse is that it can float into electronic equipment and short circuit and create all kinds of calamities, which we don't want. So vomiting really needs to be avoided at all costs. So one of my major specialties is the research in space motion sickness. Now, Mars is an interesting environment. It's not a weightless environment. It has 1/3 approximately of Earth gravity. Moon has 1/6 approximately. So there is a certain gravity there. So vomiters will go to ground, but not as fast, and will kind of start disintegrating en route to the ground. Again, going back to Heidi's artwork, it's a very interesting take on the colonizing Mars, because you have to design your menus in such a way that you may not have motion sickness, but vomiting can be caused by certain disagreeable foods or other things. So, and then I want to bring your attention to this. So what ethology is a study, you know, in the lab we take a sample or we take a subject, whether it's animal or person, and we study it in lab environments which are very controlled. Ethology is when we study completely unrestrained, whole body in completely free environment with full spectrum of interaction with that environment. And so neuroethology would be studying all that from the point of view of understanding how brain works. How do we assess our orientation? How do we interact with the environment when nothing is restrained? Okay? Wind may blow, lightnings, I may have food poisoning. There are a lot of things in the environment within and without that can interact and make no moment in time identical to another. Okay? So those things all need to be taken into account when you are in any extreme environment or critical environment, spaceflight being one of those, or any analog environment to that, where you recreate, approximate it as much as you can. And to study this, you know, I have to study senses, and we all know, I guess I don't need this, and we all know from high school biology that there are 5 senses, which is wrong. For some reason, in high school biology, they neglect to study other senses, which is just as important. For example, vestibular system. You know, we all have these bones right behind our ear, and inside that bone, completely encapsulated, there's not one but 2 senses combined into vestibular system, our system of balance. The first sense is otoliths, are those chambers with little rocks floating in a liquid endolymph inside. So if your mother, when you were young and misbehaving, told you that you have rocks in your head, she was completely right. There are rocks in those chambers that react to linear accelerations, translational movement. Linear acceleration makes those rocks detect it and give it that information to the brain. Semicircular canals are right next to it, and they are 3 loops in 3 orthogonal spaces. They're like, you know, they are all perpendicular to each other. And they respond to rotations, to angular accelerations. So those 2 senses combined give us a very precise information how we are oriented. And that's very important, because if we don't know that, then the brain kind of freaks out and creates things like motion sickness. Okay? Motion sickness here is not caused by gastric malfunctions, nothing about the stomach except that the stomach expels its substance reacting to those vestibular stimuli, not to food, really. Then there's proprioception. Nobody talks about that, but it's a fundamentally important sense to bring us in sync with where we are and what we do. Anybody knows what proprioception is? Okay, can I have a volunteer? Can I use you as a, okay. What's your name?
David.
David, could you close your eyes, please, and can I hold your hand? Okay, David's eyes are closed. David, tell me, where is your hand?
Above my head.
Above his head. Now, how does he know that? None of the high school senses tell him that. How does he know that it's above? And if I would move his head and he moves his fingers, he would know, thank you, David, he would know exactly what his hand is doing because of proprioception. That's receptors that are embedded in our tendons and muscles and tell us what are the tensions within those muscles and tendons, what are the changes in viscoelastic properties. And the brain then recalls its memory of how it felt when we did see it. And then the brain calculates, and that happens in real time. It's kind of extremely quick. We don't have to think about it. We know he knew exactly where his hand was. Okay, he wouldn't have known that if he were denied proprioception. Then he would have to see that. Us being visual animals, our primary sense is vision. You know, bats and dolphins, primary sense is auditory. They use echolocation. So the same information they would derive from echolocation. And so what I study is, sensory perception, how all of those senses are involved in perception of space, of anything around us or within us. One of the interesting perception things is perception of time. And when we start talking, when I get through this, and we start talking about the art at hand, Heidi has very interesting projects that explore our perception of time. And we'll talk about it during the discussion. I just want to kind of plant it into your mind. If we don't, ask us. And then, perception, again, starting from within, how do I feel today? Within starts with some singularity at my center of mass, inside of me. And then very near, where I can touch and explore, and farther away, where I use distance senses like vision. And then even farther away, where I have to use tools, whether it's a pointer, a probe, or a Hubble telescope. I use a tool, and there's no limit to how far I can explore space. Limit is really the boundaries of our imagination. And for me as a scientist, and for you as an artist, that has no boundaries. Okay. So Heidi's work, I really, when I started looking at her work on her website, and it's amazing how she touched upon every stage that we have to address in considering space flight and space explorations. Technology, she has a piece on space technology, space vehicles, satellites, sustenance, obviously her Mars food. Remember how I mentioned how she explores in several of her art works, she explores the perception of time and how can we manipulate that and still perceive it. And then there's a very interesting project which is on display there on International Space Station project, where and it's amazing how she's able to take 3 different motions and capture the same moment in those 3 different motions. It's quite amazing. It really takes very brilliant imagination. So the motion is the car riding on the road, so there is this visual streaming from us looking through the window, and then the person is in the car, so that person is being passively moved, and that person is flipping through pages of an illustrated book of the space station, of photographs of the space station in space, which are taken from outside, from a shuttle. And she flips them with ever increasing speed. So eventually it crosses the continuous motion threshold, and we see the space station as moving while we see the visual streaming of the road in the moving car, while we are ourselves in that passive motion. I thought that was just brilliant. And then, she deals in her art, and that's not the art she's going to be talking here, but it's in her art portfolio about survival in extreme environments, and she deals with issues of space debris. And we humans, we are quite an advanced species of animals, but we are also very irresponsible. So we really polluted not only the Earth itself, but also the space around the Earth, all lower Earth orbits are very polluted with junk, with debris. And so every space flight needs to calculate those safe orbits. And if something deorbits from one of the orbits of junk, they need to take that into account. So a huge amount of resources of NASA, and that's our money, is spent on tracking junk in space. Each piece of junk has its orbit. There is some employee who is sitting there and tracking it and making sure that it doesn't have an intercept with the orbit of our space vehicle, whatever it is. Okay, so Heidi has this incredible art that sort of documents the junk orbits and how oppressive they are. I mean, there's really no free space. I mean, if she would just plot it, if you can see this in 3D, you really have to worm your way through non-junk kind of routes there. This is also amazing. She has this art about objects that astronauts left on the moon. And that reminded me of an extraordinary book back from Vietnam era, the things we carry. Things they carried. And, you know, this things that we carry so define us. And again, moon, there are very few of those things, you know. You can see there are many, but compared to the vastness of the moon, it's very little. And to see them in this kind of proximity together, then you can reconstruct who were those people who brought them? What did they represent? And this is one of my absolute favorites, and we'll talk about it later. Right, so that's that ISS, International Space Station thing. So I already talked about it. And this is this nest variations. I mean, it was just amazing to me that she would, as an artist, I mean, I assume you never flew in space and you were not in parabolic flight, which I was. You know, I do this for a living. You know, I fly NASA's Wanted comet. So this is weightlessness, and you see the relationship between the egg and the nest, and the egg is in this suspended state. And then this is low gravity. And so this, in and of itself, intrinsically unstable situation of this egg on top of its nest is possible in low G. And this is high G, where it's so compressed and messy in terms of mass, not in terms of disorder. And you can see this from this art. You can feel the pressure and the force, and you can feel this 3D total freedom in 3 dimensions. You know, we are 3-dimensional animals, but all this space is wasted space. It's just here for comfort. We only use it, you know, up to here. But here we can use it. We can actually be up high. We can use the whole space. And she got it. So, how do I relate to those things? This is a 1G, and my point is that our perception of beauty is tied to the force of gravity. What we consider beautiful is only beautiful here, okay? In a different gravity environment, we would be considered ugly. We would be considered not fitting, okay? So in 1G, we have these, from our point of view, completely proportional body. In 0G, and that's me, by the way, free floating in the Wanted comet, in 0G there is this suspended state. So we do have a complete 3-dimensionality. And you can see that egg, it's just euphoric. And in low G, we would have this elongated, you can't afford to build up the height. You can find this equilibrium. The bodies of basketball players would be considered much more beautiful than our bodies like that. And here, in high G, this will be considered a beautiful body. The body with the center of mass much lower towards the surface of support. And the bodies like that cannot exist in this G. So our conception of beauty is very, very conditioned upon gravity. And I found it amazing that that old slide with the human figures, I had it for years and used it in several lectures, and then I saw her art and I thought, oh my goodness, this is amazing. Now about the menu for Mars, and I think I should stop here and we can discuss it when we actually are in conversation. Okay? Okay. I know I hear as well.
So thank you very much for bringing up some of those things that I did a long time ago. I had forgotten that a lot of those things, that I've been thinking about these things for a long time, and I have forgotten that some of those things relate. So thank you for that.
So, food is not just sustenance. It's not just nutrition. In our human sociology and psyche, food is also part of our identity. Mm-hmm. And in addition, and we would like that. We don't want to go far away for a long time and not have it. Like you had that spicy thing in your art, and astronauts like it because everything is so bland, and spiciness kind of makes them feel better. Well, we do know from psychological and sociological studies that familiar foods whom one likes or loves from the childhood, my grandmother's matzo ball soup. I mean, that's what would make me comfortable and feel more healthy and be more productive. How do you combine that? Because in spaceflight environment, whether it's in flight or in a colony, the main thing is to get that sustenance inside of you.
Yeah.
Okay? It's not the goal of NASA to make it pretty and taste like your grandmother's. So it's just to get this amount of nutrients, this amount of vitamins inside of you and have it absorbed. Okay?
So plating is not an issue. Right?
We don't want, okay, so how do you deal with it when food can be so many things? And one of the interesting, so these above things, of course, vegetarian or carnivorous is a huge thing, One of the art projects here is Agnes Meyer-Brandis's project, where she explores how to bring livestock into space flight. Very, very difficult task. Probably not going to happen. Mm-hmm. Probably, and by probably I mean for sure, it's going to be vegetarian stuff and the stuff that is freeze-dried and then reconditioned somehow in flight or there
Yeah,
for
you know,
consumption.
in our habitat, we were raising crickets.
Right.
Yeah.
That's one thing.
So what did you think of that? Are these kinds of things being discussed?
Thank you for bringing it up. Yes, they are, because they're huge. They're like a great source of protein and non-vegan protein,
Mhm.
which is a different type of protein. People are disgusted with crickets, except some people from certain cultures are not, but the majority of the astronauts are from Western cultures.
Yeah, and we found people would come in to, and we had crickets that we were raising, but we also had cricket powder, basically cricket meal
Right.
flour, and so we were using the cricket flour in a couple of times. Somebody made a cricket macaroni and cheese.
How was that?
It was actually really good, honestly. Yeah, she made it like with a bechamel. Yeah, and it was particular, but it was quite good. And yeah, and somebody else came in and said that actually crickets, they loved eating them. It was a guy from Mexico, and he said that they ate them all the time. They would get them like popcorn on the street.
Yeah.
And it was like a treat, a special treat. So yeah, I mean, so I guess it just...
And NASA has a huge section that deals with foods, nutrition. Crickets, if they don't look like crickets, if they're like a candy bar or whatever,
Yeah.
maybe fine. But you know, crickets as live crickets, and in some cultures that's very good food, and it's extremely nutritious. That's a problem because again, raising crickets in a space station or in a colony is, you know, there are problems within that. You know, they escape, they can infiltrate equipment, whatever. And, you know, with this in mind, I want to go to that part of your Menu on Mars thing was actually the picture of the habitat.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's in my next
Yeah,
slide.
yeah, it's the habitat in...
No. I'd say let's stay with this.
The habitat image is it's from a place in Utah. So it's a Mars Society, I believe it is, habitat.
Right, that's
Yeah,
right, I
yeah,
know
yeah.
about them. But the issue here, stop here, is the contrast between this incredible vastness of space in that colony, in that planet, and this constrained claustrophobic environment of human habitation. And you brought it up that
Yeah.
it has to be in those kind of inflatable modules or something. But tremendous amount of psychological problems come with that. You put, you know, 7 unrelated individuals into this little bubble, and with the recycling air, which means that all the sweat and fart and burp and everything gets recirculated, you know, people get on each other's nerves.
You know, one thing that we were trying to think about in our habitat too was sound. Was that you'll never have a silence because all the machines are going,
that's right.
and so because of our space was inflated by a fan, we had this kind of constant din going anyway. And then we had a sound installation by John Roach, which
You mean like to mask?
well, it kind of was atmospheric sounds that were referring to the space also. But one thing about the crickets that I discovered was that they chirp. Right. So we had like 1,000 crickets, and it actually, I mean, it was great because it was this natural sound, and so it made this sort of comforting sound that we didn't expect that at all. And so at one point, the sound installation had these contact mics and hydrophone mics, and we put them in the cricket container.
Yeah.
So anyway, so we had kind of had that going with it.
Well, about the sound, it's an interesting thing that you brought it up, and it's kind of cute, you know, the cricket sounds and all. But again, when we study psychologically, scientifically, we study sense of comfort, okay? So all those cute and comforting things, by the time we are getting on each other's nerves, by the time we have been together for long enough and everything you do irritates me because you burp at just the wrong time, or you want to be by the window when I want to be by the window, or, you know, there's only one treadmill, and it's that. And at that time, at that stage in relationships, cricket sound will drive you nuts. It literally will amplify this out of control. So you can't have cricket, sorry.
How do you train people? So you talk about these things and you train people for these things. What sorts of things do you do to train people?
Well, one of the things that, can we go to the next slide? One of the things that I brought up about your art is meals as communion, meals as relationship building. And in astronaut training protocol, this is actually used. This is actually used as what in the military is known as unit cohesion. So it builds that cohesion. And it's almost Pavlovian conditioning. You know, they train you to commune through meals. And so meals then that happened, and not all meals are group meals in a space flight environment. It depends on individual schedules. But they build in that time where people get together for meals, and that kind of refreshes the relationship. And another thing is this, food as representation of identity and of tradition, and that also brings comfort into space flight tensions. I was at some point considered for space flight training with NASA. And I thought a lot about, you know, if I were an astronaut, what kind of astronaut would I be? I didn't want to be just a generic astronaut. I wanted to be me, a Russian, American, Jewish woman scientist, okay? How do I bring all that into the space flight? And one of the things, I mean, I'm from Russia, you know, I grew up in the 50s and 60s when Jews in space, and that's my next slide, I would think of this. I would not, it would be delusional. I'd be considered a lunatic if I would read anything else into that. Plus a woman, forget it. So, let's go to the next one. So, about this bringing identity into space flight, food is one of the great things. And some of the food we can bring, and some food we cannot bring. But the challenge is to create art and to create rituals that can bring that in and be consistent with tradition, not disrespectful to tradition, but that's where art comes in. You gotta be creative. You can't do this, like I told you with vomit. Why? Same thing. It breaks into droplets. Now, you deal with environments that have some gravity, so it wouldn't break into droplets, but it will be very vulnerable to that. If you spill a little bit, you don't know where to land. Lighting candles, not possible. And by the way, the fans, the noise from fans has to be, the fans have to run in those environments 100% of the time, because just like with the candle, which would burn all the oxygen around it, and in weightlessness, there's no convection currents to bring new oxygen to the burn. So convection currents are movements of the air that are driven by gravity. Hot air is light, cold air is heavy. So hot air from here goes up, cold air gets sucked in, and we have a burn. And that's why the flame looks like that, because the vector of the momentum is upward. Hot air rises up. Here, in 0G, all oxygen is burned, and then it suffocates. It just chokes on itself. So this is out. Barbecue cooking is out. But hot plates, which you used, are good. But fans need to be run because, like with the candle, we will use all the oxygen in the air around us, and then we will be hypoxic. We will have oxygen deficit. So there will be fans. Crickets and no crickets, but that's the noise of the background in any space environment, whether it's a spaceship or a habitat in a colony. Yeah, but food is integral in creating those new traditions. That's how it's going to be done, through food, through food as communion and food as flavors that are reminiscent. And the recall for those memories, that's how you train astronauts. You build it in through conditioning. Can I have another slide? I don't know if I have anything. Oh, no, that's it.
I think we can open it up to the audience. Does anyone have any questions? We have about 15 minutes where people are free to ask.
What is your last name, please?
Kaplan, with a K.
With a K, thank you. Jana?
Jana, yes.
I'm very curious about the taste. Taste disappears in the weightless environment, or it changes and minimizes. There were several astronauts who experienced a reduced gravity on the moon. How much of their taste came back when they were in the 1/6 G of the moon, if any? Did any of their taste restore?
I don't know. I don't know.
I don't think they ate on the moon.
Yes, it did.
They
were there for
didn't
several
eat.
days.
They didn't eat out of the space capsule.
No.
They ate inside the lunar module.
Of course, but the gravity was the same
Okay,
inside.
the gravity was the
Yeah,
same.
it didn't
I
disappear.
really don't know.
I haven't heard of any long-term effects on
Yeah,
taste from those missions, so I don't know.
I haven't either, but there must be something. I know there are studies at NASA on taste.
And taste
on
is
that sense.
important. For
And
the-
it is important, especially where food, I mean, again, taste and smell are very affect astronauts' well-being very positively in relation with food, but very negatively in relation to the rest of the habitat, because there are a lot of smells. Like the vomit comet that I fly. I mean, that thing is, you smell it even outside the airplane. It's permeated with the smell of vomit.
Oh, no.
And at some point you don't notice it anymore, but smell and taste interact, and they are affected. I don't know much about that particular.
Did anyone see the Martian, which I just happened to see recently? Does anyone know if that, you're doing your simulation, but that was a large-scale Hollywood, coming from a book. Was that close to the reality that you see when you think about these things? If you've seen it?
Yeah, I read the book and loved it and saw the movie. Yep. So yeah, I'm all over that. Yeah. So the film seemed to me. I mean, it was great, and I think it was written by an engineer, and it has been praised for like exactitude or whatever. I mean, maybe you.
Well, I found it very similar when I looked at your inflated bubbles. It looked very similar to what Matt Damon built there for his little greenhouse.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same. You have to have it hermetically sealed. You have to pump air and have pressure and have air, breathable air.
Yeah. It did, like, I would say that it did seem a a little bit glamorous and a little bit too clean. Like one thing that we were talking about a lot was the ubiquity of dust on Mars. Like the particles of dust are super fine, and we were guessing for our habitat that it would get in everything. And then that was one thing that you'd have to overcome in terms of food, is not only the texture of that, but the taste of it, and that, you know, and that would be another reason or rationale or whatever for having strong flavors. So, you know, like getting that dust off of gaskets and out of filters, and like it's electrostatically clings to everything. So, you know, it would be everywhere basically. It would track all over the place. So.
Same on the moon. Moon dust is also very, very fine. The air within those inflatable habitats is not the air pumped from the outside. On the moon there isn't any. The atmosphere of Mars is not conducive to life. So it's going to be artificially created atmosphere that's filtrated. So I don't know how the dust from the outside will get in unless it comes in with the spacesuit. But larger question is the waste management, because you know the kitchen refuse and the human waste, all those things you can't just throw out the window, and there's no sanitation system. It has to be packaged. It has to be vacuum packaged and stored until you go back home and take it with you. It's just like you go to the beach, bring it, take it back, whatever that phrase is. But it's a huge issue in spaceflight is cleanliness. Space station is filthy. It is absolutely filthy. And not because they don't, you know, wash dishes after themselves, but, you know, every time you sneeze or anything, you know, everything is just floats around and you don't know where it goes. When we go on parabolic flight, I tell all my staff to take off their wedding rings, diamonds, whatever. You know, if it floats around, you'll never find it, but it'll end up in my equipment somewhere and create problems. Everything is just refloating, and even if it's precipitated somewhere, at some point it will disconnect and start floating again. The smells are terrible. It's not a healthy environment. It's not a healthy environment. And you did, in some of your, I took all my pictures from your slideshow, and you have that. I mean, you touched on everything. There's this bunch of plastic cups with, you know, some crunch napkins and like, what do you do with them? They take an enormous amount of space. I mean, people in space, the most expensive commodity is space. It's so cramped. Yeah.
Question. Protein. What is the source of protein?
Crickets. Maybe mealworms instead. I don't know. I'm just kidding. If we can't have crickets.
Well, in your menus, you know, protein is an obligatory component of a menu. So there are vegetable proteins, there are animal proteins.
We tried to stick with a vegetarian diet on ours, and so we had a lot of dried beans and peanut-based things and soy products.
So
and
did you have tofu?
Not really, but we did make a tofu-like thing out of garbanzo flour. If you've ever done that,
I have not. But
it's really interesting. Yeah.
I have a question. So, I mean, we're so advanced in getting to Moon and the Mars and technologically advanced, we're kind of willing to kind of leave everything behind with food. Surely we should be thinking about, I mean, I agree kind of like, you know, we want that turkey dinner or we want, but, you know, the way we're thinking is that, like things like being a vegetarian and then someone says, oh, do you want a turkey burger that's vegetarian? And you're like, that doesn't make sense. So do we really need to think about food being reminiscent or taste being something that we reminisce about. You know, can we invent new tastes that actually do have all the proteins, but that we're not disappointed with? You know, I can imagine when they're on Moon or on the space station and like, oh, well, this is certainly not macaroni and cheese flavor as I know it.
Yeah.
So why do we strive for that when, if we create these new tastes and flavors that are even more
Creating new
beneficial?
tastes. Now that's good. I like that. Like, you know, we're creating new traditions. Why not new tastes?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Tastes
absolutely. Yeah.
are primal things. They're so deep, especially those that we crave. They are going back to immediate postnatal moments, and then through our so creating new tastes would be, again, I'm from Russia. I believe in Pavlovian conditioning, so you can train anybody to do anything. So I guess it's possible. I love this idea. I would like to find out if NASA actually works on that. Because they do those burgers, they freeze dry them, and then there are, packaging has the injectable hydration, and then you microwave it. And what comes out is a turkey burger. Now, it doesn't taste anything like, so what NASA does is they add smells. They actually have artificial substance of smell that they add to the water that you inject in it, because you can't have it in the freeze-dried burger. It's not going to preserve as well. So, you know, people are creative, but astronauts hate the food. On the other hand, you know, college students hate the food on college campuses. So, you know, when I came back from Russia, to me, it was like Ritz-Carlton. So we learn as we go along, yeah. But the craving tastes are hard to change, the ones you crave.
For us, for the younger generation, maybe not.
Probably.
We need to work fast on
Probably.
them.
Yeah.
Yes.
What's the optimal number of people in one of these bubbles, if let's say they're in Mars? And how many people can you put there before they start killing each other?
Oh, that's a good question.
Or
Actually,
is there harmony or a team that works?
It's one of the hardest questions. And I don't know, in your work, like how does the group formation that goes from restaurant to restaurant to explode or meeting to meeting, is it a cohesive group?
yeah,
Or
I mean,
it's fluid, people come and
it
go?
was very fluid, but we found that it worked really well if there was about 10 people or so. You know, as far as like a conversation that everyone could be in on, and if it was bigger than that, then it would sort of split into I mean, just like any dinner group, you know. So it was based on that, but I don't know if that, you know, maps really to like living together in a habitat.
Yeah, you know, technology is something NASA people can solve. They have some brilliant minds there. The issues of human psychology are much more difficult to resolve. Not all of them are completely predictable from the ground training. Issues pop up. Issues of gender dynamics.
In
That's
the-
where there are issues of gender dynamics.
There definitely were issues, and there were earlier observations, you know, when Americans had the Skylab back when, those were very low occupancy. They would probably have 2 or 3. Astra 3 was considered a big crowd. With the Mir station, when Americans collaborated with the Russians on board the Mir space station, that's when the extent of psychological problems became really heavy, and NASA didn't know what to do about it. They had psychiatrists on board, you know, on the medical team just to just to check that nobody has seizures before they, in their medical history. But in terms of the issues of group dynamics, they were terrible issues. Those are multicultural teams, so there are Russians and Americans. All Russians knew English, none of the Americans knew Russian. Sure, Russians knew English, but they were pissed that Americans didn't make an effort to learn Russian.
Right.
So they were getting angry about it.
Yeah.
And it's a very cramped environment. So window time. Okay, when you're at the window and look outside, that's the only time you can have privacy. You can just kind of block everything else out. So window time. Why do Russians get more time than us? Treadmill time was another killer. Everybody wanted more treadmill time. And they really were almost ready to strangle each other.
There's also the instance of Biosphere 2. Are you familiar with that?
Yes,
Yeah, and so that
exactly.
was where 8 people entered a sealed environment in New Mexico and Arizona. Yeah, okay. And they and they actually split into factions of two groups basically that weren't speaking to each other. So they would only they really weren't speaking to each other.
How long were they there?
2 years. And I think that I forget when the breakdown.
One or two demanded egress. They didn't want to stay, so I think at least one had to be gotten out because it was just disintegrating.
Yeah, but they found so 8 somehow, and there was some study afterward that somehow 8 is too big. Somehow it splits. You split into smaller groups. I don't know.
Was there any work done on the dynamics before they went in there, or was it just whoever showed up got in?
No, they matched them. There was
They did.
very big so-called insight, but again, in those extreme environments, the predictable things don't work anymore. It just breaks down. And I know that there is a new interest in it, in that among, for example, group therapy social workers who want to use the findings from the space research into building those group dynamics into the group therapy work with, for example, vulnerable populations, teenagers at risk or something like that. NASA's number and the international spaceflight community number was 7, well, 7 to 8. And so the International Space Station was designed for 7 astronaut occupancy, which hasn't happened because at some point Americans stopped supporting it in terms of the second Bush first administration of the second Bush president when he decided that we don't have the money for that. So the international community said, but it's international, don't you have obligations? So it's been 3 to 4 people occupancy since that time on, which really is a kiss of death because that's barely enough to do the maintenance so that it doesn't get contaminated and fall apart. It's not enough. It's not enough to do research and to really continue creative exploration, so not much has been done on the space station since then, other than keeping it operational.
We kind of have this fallout with Russia recently,
Well, we still have an obligation since NASA decommissioned the shuttle. NASA doesn't have anything that flies now, but they do still have the obligation towards the International Space Station. So they pay the Russians $70 million per astronaut per launch to fulfill those obligations until
we can't make boosters, right? They have the only rocket engines, I think.
they have the only rocket that can bring astronauts from here to the space station. Elon Musk has an engine that can take cargo, but no one is as yet advanced enough to take people. And in space flight, they don't want a fatality. That will be very bad PR and will take it back a couple of years. So, but the questions about psychological environment is, first of all, it's very tightly connected with food. Second of all, it's one of the most difficult ones, one where NASA isn't as omnipotent as they are with technology and with funding. We just don't know. I mean, you know, the movie is about survival in some sort of wilderness, and the books written about it and supposedly based on real experience, they're not applicable because it's just one person or two people. It's not people who are deliberately put there for a certain number of months or years, who are not just there for a ride, but they have to do tasks.
What about submarines?
Who? Submarines. Yeah, problems up to here.
But it's similar in some
Yes,
ways.
but it's a military discipline environment. There's a chain of command, and there is hierarchy that is in your bones. Every astronaut is a prima donna in his or her own right. There is no such military discipline and cannot be in a creative environment. I think that's why, and I'm glad you asked that question, I think that's why this cooperative work of space scientists with artists and with writers, with people who explore the other dimension of human psyche, who really understand that much better than scientists do. That's where the value is, to bring this kind of art, to start these kind of conversations, to illuminate something that, you know, NASA scientists are not thinking about. It just doesn't occur to them. It didn't occur to them during the Mir times that it would be a nice gesture for Americans to know 20 Russian words. It just expresses a good feeling. Of course Russians know English. That's not the point.
Yeah. Well, but now in ISS, I mean, it's not, that was Mir when they did know the...
Now it's a requirement.
That's
They
right.
have to know Russian and another language.
Do we have time for one more question? Any questions?
You didn't bring any food with you, did you?
Tonight? No, sorry.
No, thank you. Anyway.
I have a question. Did you collect from people who tried your foods during the actual eating events? Did you collect any feedback, like let's say later on, how did it feel consuming that food? Did they feel comfortable inside? How did it feel? Did they feel like, you know, like if I eat a good Russian borscht, I just feel ecstatically happy. That taste lingers. Did you debrief them like the next day?
No, but I think we should have a follow-up, like some kind of follow-up survey.
Yeah.
That would be really fun,
I
actually.
think that would
yeah.
have some interesting stuff. How it felt,
Yeah,
remembering
after.
that, thinking about that
Yeah.
food.